Welcome to the Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, back with the last episode of season 7, and I've got a very special guest. This is actually the first guest on the show who's actually from Japan, although now he's living in Canada, and he's a fellow podcaster, and that is Kota of the Against Japanism podcast. Kota, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you. I think I found your podcast through the Japanese politics group on Facebook, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, you're on there. Okay.
Yeah. I'm on there, and I listened to the episodes you got up there, and right from the start, like your intro episode was amazingly informative, and then the discussion you guys had about Ghost of Tsushima and about Marxism's history in Japan, just really fascinating stuff. So it's a wonderful show, and it's very interesting to hear this kind of, because your perspective as a Japanese radical is not something that I'm able to hear much, at least not in English. So it's a very refreshing point of view I'm getting. So but I'm kind of rambling a little bit, so why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and about the podcast?
My name is Kota. I'm the host of Against Japanism podcast, and my project is twofold. One is to critically study the histories of Japanese imperialism, fascism, and neocolonialism, and Japanism as a sort of an ideology that reflects these systems of oppression and exploitation, sort of a nationalist ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And this view sort of promotes that, Japan as a sort of homogeneous and unchanging, sort of like internalizes Orientalist, idealized image of Japan, right? And for the reactionary purpose. Yeah.
And I've seen that in very subtle ways too, like just living here in Japan for so long. It's just like, even like the focus on Japan as being a unique country, right? The whole idea of like, in Japan, the joke we always say is, in Japan, we have 4 seasons, right? That whole thing. And just like, there's always this focus, even when I'm, talking to students and stuff like that, they say like, in Japan, we do this, and in other countries, you do this. And there's always this focus on Japan as like completely separate from the rest of the world. And that's like a more subtle form of that kind of, that focus on the homogeneity thing too.
Mm-hmm. And the second aspect of my project is to challenge that narrative by also studying the histories of revolutionary movements,
mm-hmm.
And various social struggles, or like anti-colonial struggles that resisted Japanese imperialism,
mm-hmm.
Which shows that, Japan is not a harmonious society. Like there's no conflict, or, like it's like, sort of ideological homogeneity, right? Like
mm-hmm.
Japan has a long history of like communist, anarchist organizations, as well as a lot of anti-colonial activists, from Korea or China.
Mm-hmm.
They organize inside Japan as well. So yeah, sort of like it kind of challenged that. By doing that, I try to expose that there's a class struggle happening in Japan as well.
Yeah, and that's
just like in any other societies. Like Japan is not unique in that respect. Yeah.
And that's something that's often because you hear about these class struggles in other countries, but in Japan it's something that really is not touched on a lot. And Japan has that whole idea of the they often say that these days Japan's biggest export to the rest of the world is culture, and it's through manga and anime and movies and video games and whatnot. And you don't often see the kind of stuff that focuses on those types of class struggles. So I only know a small bit about it, but from what I learned, like one example I teach my students about is the Taisho era, which it's kind of like overlooked a lot in Japanese history, right? You got the Meiji era, and then after that you got Showa and all that. And then they don't talk too much about Taisho, even though Taisho had a whole lot of these like labor movements and all that kind of thing going on during it.
Yeah, and there aren't a lot of movies about the era either, actually. There's actually one good movie called Guillotine and Christendom.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I'll send you a link later, but it's
absolutely.
pretty long but pretty fantastic film about this traveling female sumo wrestling team and it's the friendship and romance with like a band of anarchists who are trying to assassinate the emperor. So it's kind of it's an interesting movie.
Okay.
It's from the era, but I don't really know many other movies.
Yeah, and and I remember I did one of the stories I covered in one of my classes is Akutagawa's Rashomon, and trying to showing the links between like Taisho and because he was writing in the Taisho period, and just like subtly how there's some class struggles and stuff like that seeps into that work that my students, never, all of them have read that story in school, but they'd never picked up on any of that kind of stuff otherwise, because they don't really know what was happening during that time period. But today I wanted to talk about this movie, which is this kind of conversation about the history of radical movements in Japan ties into this movie, which is Nagisooshima's Night and Fog in Japan, which was released in 1960. And it had kind of an interesting release history because it was funded by, it was a movie that was released by Shochiki, which was apparently a very right-wing movie producer, if I recall. Shochiku, I'm sorry, thank you. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's like one of the major production companies like Toho and Shochiku. Well, I don't think Toei existed back then. I don't know. I don't really know about the history of these companies much, but I didn't know they're conservative.
Yeah, that's what I've heard that they've got this conservative bent, which was kind of a surprise why they bankrolled this film in the first place. And Oshima got a lot of funding and a lot of creative freedom because Shochiku had this strategy of promoting different young directors and kind of like promoting a new wave of Japanese cinema. But then a few days after it was released, the studio, pulled it from the market because the reason they gave was that the Japanese Socialist Party, a politician in the Japanese Socialist Party, Asanuma, was killed by a far right student, and they said that was the reason why they pulled it out of the market, which doesn't make a lot of sense because this film was against that kind of ideology to begin with.
Yeah, it is also, I read that he knew it was coming. Like he knew there was a lot of pressure from the higher up in the company, so he felt like he had to speed up the production. That's why it has such a sort of like I don't know if I can say amateurish, but I mean it's his first not first, but first major production film. But it's like it has a really like sort of like raw quality to it, and people sort of like messing up their lines, but still like, they keep going and stuff.
Well, yeah, it's got a very theatrical quality is something that really stood out to me. And it's very much like I could picture this as a stage play. That it really feels more like a stage play than it does a movie.
And this sort of like alienation effect that coined by Bertolt Brecht, like a German playwright and critic, sort of like makes viewers feel like they're, sort of reminds the viewers that they're watching a play or a movie, and sort of like this strange effect of like, sort of like I really like that aspect of it. And
it was definitely, and just even with the fact that the actors play both the past and present versions of themselves, something which my wife remarked on. She's like, when we flash back to the college years, and she's like, they don't look like college students. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm like, I think that's kind of what he was trying to do, is because trying to capture the feeling of it being a play.
Yeah, I think a lot of actors are older than little older than college students.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, I love this film so much. Like, I think I've seen a lot of Oshima films, but this really stands out. Also sort of like relates to my own experience as an activist.
Okay,
And
so
sort of yeah, go ahead.
so sorry, go ahead. I want to hear.
Well, kind of like dealing with the sort of like interpersonal aspect of like conflicts and disagreements and styles of leadership and organizational theory and stuff like that. The details are really interesting and relatable to me.
And so what was your well, let's talk a little bit about the history of the film first. So this was released in 1960, and it's about the 1950 and the 1960 student left-wing protest movements, including to the Yampo Treaty. And specifically, this movie is set after the protests against was it a renewal? I think it was, of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which basically, indefinitely gave U.S. a permanent presence in Japan, permanent military presence in Japan.
Yeah, I think it's the first time it was signed and was renewed in 1970. It was signed on. Well, the big protest was on June 15th. And
June 15th,
it came into effect on June 19th.
Yes, yeah.
But what's notable is that the film came out only in November of that year. Only 4 months later.
Yeah.
Sorry, 5 months later of the protest. So it's really like just fresh, right? Sort of has a contemporary feel to it. Like, just think about, there's a big Black Lives Matter protest, and 4 months later there's a movie about it, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of like how speedy it was.
Well, which is one of the strengths of Japanese cinema, because one of the big things about the Japanese film industry is because it doesn't have the kind of big budgets and big productions that, say the American film industry does. And you have these directors who are very much working directors. Like, they have to make 3 or 4 movies a year just to make a living. And so and that allows for these very tight production schedules. So you could do a movie that's very relevant and very current, just a few months after a big event like this.
Yeah. Also, like another reason that I like this movie is that it probably makes little sense to people who don't know the historical context.
Yeah, this movie definitely does not hold your hand. Even with what I do know about that period, like, I found myself kept checking my phone to just kind of brush up on some history here and there, because this just throws you right into the middle of the drama and doesn't really explain much about the context of it. Which and I read a few other reviews of this on Letterboxd, and a few different people were commenting on the fact that they had a little trouble following what was happening because of that.
Yeah, it actually didn't make a lot of sense to me either when I first watched it. So at the time, the part that stuck out the most is what I was saying earlier. Like, it's like a group of activists fighting amongst themselves and disagreements and sort of harm and accountability and such. But as I started this podcast and learned more about that period, this time it made much more sense to me in terms of timeline of the events that were happening at the time. And in general, the history of the 50s that I didn't know much about before. So it was really fresh watching this again.
Yeah.
Maybe I can sort of go over.
Yes, please do. I was actually just about to ask you. Yeah, I was just about to ask you that.
So, I mean, the timeline, it's all it kind of goes back and forth between past and present. So, the party that's being referred to in this film is the Japanese Communist Party that still exists,
right?
As one of the opposition parties. So during the war, before the war, in Taisho and early Showa period, for pretty much the whole time they existed, they existed underground as an illegal organization outlawed by the state.
Right.
So they had to basically start and restart again and again, and every time they restart it, they basically round up all the organizers, and they end up in jail. And there's a process of like after the peace preservation law came into effect, this law is mentioned in the movie as well. Sort of like in the sense of, it's being repeated after the war.
One of them even comments on the fact that it's the secret police all over again. There's that one line.
Yeah, exactly. So after the law that came out, more people got arrested. Not only that, they were forced to go through this process of tenko, which means in English like to fall over. What this was basically was that the state facilitated this process of like a conversion of revolutionaries, communists. They got them to renounce their political conviction and publicly say that they're not communists anymore. So other like sort of like lower ranking organizers and those other like rank and file members will follow. So it was part of the repressive tactics of the state at the time. All this is to say that they were highly illegal and heavily suppressed. But the war ended and the Allied occupation took over, and they sort of quote unquote democratized Japan, at least for a brief period of time. So
and then the U.S. got scared because the political prisoners were all the left-wing people, and then they started getting scared, so they start cutting deals with the fascists again.
Yeah. Also, the international situation changed, right? Like now they're in the World War II is over, but now the Cold War, the new threat is communism, right? And this Korea War and the Chinese Revolution is getting traction. So, and of course the Soviet Union,
right?
So they got really scared, and after a few years, they basically did only a few years of like progressive reforms, like land reform. They're legalizing a lot of like labor organizing and communist activities. So there was like a upsurge of these activities for a while, but
I think I remember, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the original Constitution was actually written by the left-wing activists, and that was one of the things that the U.S. got scared about, and then eventually the U.S. just because then they brought in the right-wingers and they couldn't find agreements. Then eventually the U.S. just wrote the Constitution themselves. But the original Constitution was actually a much more progressive document, the one that was actually written by them. Am I correct in my understanding of that?
I don't really know about the details of like drafting first process of drafting the Constitution. That's really interesting, and that's something that I should study in the future as well. But the Allied, the GHQ had basically that makes sense. Like I think they could.
Which is a little ironic when you hear a lot of the right-wing politicians in Japan complain about the U.S. imposed constitution, when the original constitution was something they would have hated much more.
Yeah, one of the things that they did is to preserve the emperor system, right?
Yeah.
Because they probably thought it's a good way of sort of ideologically keeping Japanese people together as a symbol of, even though Hirohito, like he renounced that
his divinity,
he was not a god or whatever. But yeah, sort of like one of my episodes, like a previous episodes with Gavin Walker, he talks about the reverse course that happened after. So like I think it was on 1947 or 8, there was a plan to do a big general strike led by the Communist Party, but then MacArthur thought it was too big of a threat, so that he basically called it off. Obviously a very top-down process, right? Kind of ironic that they wanted to like democratize Japan, but now it was done.
New boss, same as the old.
Top-down way. So it's like, anyway, so that was the sort of beginning of this reverse course. And also Gavin used the term re-Japanization. So during the war, Japan was this sort of like multi-ethnic empire, right? Obvious, but not, of course, not to say that this imperial empire was very brutal, right? Like very violent and exploitative towards other Asian peoples and the colonies that Japan possessed at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, what was his name?
Um,
Abe's grandfather, Ishii, who was, he was a brutal governor of Manchuria.
yeah, he was. He was working with all these big corporations. I
Mm-hmm.
think Toyota. That yeah, I mean, they still
Yeah,
exist
yeah,
today. All these zaibatsu are still around under different, um, kind of like a so-called democratic
yeah, yeah.
guise. But, anyways, so where was I? Yeah,
I,
so yeah, they basically reversed this defascization process and try to like no wait. So before that, so yeah, Japan was sort of like a at least formally it was sort of like this cosmopolitan empire, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
and despite its violence, it was a very sort of diverse,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like Gavin said, like it's almost like fascist multiculturalism.
Yeah, yeah,
Sort of
yeah.
ideal of like Pan-Asianism, sort of
Mm-hmm.
the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That was, sort of off. I mean, it's a cover for Japanese imperialism,
Right.
but after the war, in the dissolution of this empire, Japan found itself being sort of like renationalized. Become reconstituted as just a regular nation state, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose. And this came with sort of um, re-emergence or re-strengthening of Japanese nationalist ideology.
Mm-hmm.
This was done intentionally because they wanted to counter communism, which is the ideology of class struggle and
Right.
revolution. To counter that, you need sort of like very cohesive national identity
Mm-hmm.
that goes beyond class, right?
Right.
So they preserved the emperor system, which served a purpose, but they also like you said, restored a lot of like previous fascist leaders into the
Mm-hmm.
positions of power. Not just Kishi, but some doctors and medical experts that are involved in the unit
Oh, 731.
731. Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah. What was his name? Ishii. He ended up. Why don't? There's not a lot of, as I recall, there's not a lot of documentation about what happened, but most theories believe that he actually ended up being given a visa to move to America, and he lived out his life in America. Apparently,
yeah. Oh wow.
I believe so. It's been a while since I looked into that.
I mean, it's like Operation Paperclip, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, not, basically the Americans found it convenient to, use these people for their own
Mm-hmm.
purpose.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so that was a big reverse course, and a lot of revolutionaries saw that happening. But part of this process, Japanese Communist Party was once again driven underground,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a huge like red purge, red scare. The communists or people who were suspected of being communists are driven out of their public, sector jobs and
Mm-hmm.
whatever
Very similar
positions.
to what was happening in America around the same time too, with the McCarthyism stuff too.
Yeah, 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 and protests were outlawed and such. So this is a sort of one of the contexts that shapes the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But in response to that, they're dribbling underground. Japanese Communist Party turned to armed struggle
Mm-hmm.
and took inspiration from the Chinese Revolution and the protracted People's War
Mm-hmm.
that was happening there. They're based in the countryside, guerrilla warfare against Japanese imperialism and the reactionary nationalist party after that. And then they successfully overthrow the nationalists and
Mm-hmm.
they established the People's Republic of China. So they're really inspired by that. They thought Japan's conditions similar to China, like a little agrarian, rural populations,
Mm-hmm.
farmers. So they tried to emulate that and went to the countryside and work with the people and start an armed struggle there. So that went on for probably like 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, it didn't really go well. Conditions were not as similar as they thought they were.
Mm-hmm.
So partly because the U.S. Allied occupation did the land reform, and they sort of accomplished what, like landlordism wasn't a thing anymore. A lot of like people had their own property. A lot of farmers were small landowners themselves and working their own land and such. So it wasn't the same. It didn't really create this environment that's conducive to guerrilla warfare, rural-based guerrilla warfare. So they weren't successful. So the party changed their position, they changed their policy like 180 degrees, and they strictly confined themselves to electoralism, just win seats through election,
working within the
peaceful
system and all that.
coexistence.
Yeah.
Like, in the movie they talk about dialogue, no more like militancy. You don't want to scare off the masses, so just sing, dance, and potlucks and stuff. So that's how what happens in the movie. Like, it's sort of like a change of mood, and some of the characters sort of feel alienated from that. Like, is this a revolution, or is this what does this do to us? Just singing, dancing? Is this like, they have an argument about that. So this is a sort of like context, and of course that leads up to 1960, right? Ample protests against the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Sort of like the movie involves several different generations of activists.
Yeah, you've got the university professor who's always kind of hanging around, and then you've got the people who were active in the 1950s, and then 10 years later you've got the new activists in the 1960s. One of whom is Nozawa's bride, Reiko.
Yeah, so that generation, and Ota, right, the guy who breaks into the wedding. Shows up at the wedding. One of the guys who shows up the wedding uninvited and start challenging people there. He's a sort of the youngest generation of activists who they don't say this in the movie, but he is actually he says this like near the end, like he's the mainstream faction of Zen Gakuren, which is I forgot the full name of it, like all students.
Yeah, I've got it up here. Yeah, it's the abridgment of Zen Nihon Gakusei Jichikai Sorengo, which is All Japan Federation of Student Self-Government Associations.
Yeah, so when the group started, it was mostly controlled by the Japanese Communist Party, but then that change of policy from armed struggle to electoralism, that alienated a lot of the younger members. So there was split in Zengakuren, and the dissident faction formed a group called Bunto.
Yeah.
It's like it's a German word.
Right, yeah. There was the first Bund and there was the second Bund, and it's from what I got here, the reading, it's like there were many different rival sects all throughout the 1960s, but there were like these three major groupings. So there was Minseido, which was very heavily affiliated with JCP, and then there was the Sampa Zengakuren, which was alliance of critical of JCP. So that was the Bund and the Kaihoha and the Chukakuha. And then there was the Kakumaruha, which was the revolutionary Marxist faction of the Japan Revolutionary Communist League.
Yeah, so it's like a collection of Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists and various revolutionary groups that are critical of the Japanese Communist Party. So Ota is part of that. I think he's a Trotskyist himself.
I think they made mention of that a few times.
He was using.
Yeah.
And Nakayama, who is he likes to do speeches. He always speaks fine. He doesn't. He's one of the leadership figures part of the party. He's one of the party members. He's clearly with the JCP, right? He's very loyal to the JCP.
Yeah.
And also has this kind of very bureaucratic, sort of elitist, kind of like very almost like a demagogic quality to it. He just turns everything into like sort of interpersonal stuff into political, ideological issue, and
one of the things that really stood out,
really want to listen to people and engage.
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out to me was at the end of the movie when he's given this big speech, and at one point the subtitles just stop, and I'm trying to listen to it because even though my Japanese isn't great, but I know enough to get by and stuff. But even like listening to him, like you can even barely hear him because the music's like overshadowing his speech, and like it's just, and the camera's not focused on him at all. It's focused on these other people just looking completely despondent and like feeling like they don't really have a feeling like the fight's like kind of gone out of them now, while he's just still giving these speeches while the fog just rises up. I thought that was a really interesting way of juxtaposing those things, and really kind of shows like how the leadership's not really listening to the people anymore, and there's this huge disconnect that's happening.
Yeah, I really love the ending. It's just shows like everyone's sick of hearing his shit, right? Like people making this really like, oh man, I'm so tired of this, and also like a little confusion and uncertainty. After Ota gets arrested, right? He runs out and gets arrested by cops who are hiding. But then like he doesn't, Nakayama doesn't care about him. Like even he was attacked by the enemy and took away. Like he blames him. Like he thinks it's his fault. He's like being ultra left and all these rhetoric about so like that's I really like the ending. It's like it really like I think I read some commentaries and reviews of the film. Like it's about they're so divided. They can't talk to each other. They really emphasize the sort of like divisiveness of the situation. But I think the film is clear indictment of the Japanese Communist Party and their politics and their approach. And I think Nakayama is a villain in this movie.
I think so too. I think that came across very clearly. It's just like the way he, and like even like when Misako's talking about him, right? She's talking about making up her mind to divorce him and all that kind of stuff too. And yeah, I think it surprised me that anyone wouldn't think that because I thought it was pretty obvious to me, at least, that he was definitely kind of like the villain of the movie.
Yeah, I think it is more like sort of postmodern reading of it. It's like, they can communicate with each other kind of stuff. I don't know. I had a different reading of, like, I think it's more, I mean, it is a sort of pessimistic. It's night and fog, right? So it's kind of like despair and confusion, uncertainty and stuff. It's definitely
that was
there.
one of it. Yeah, the pessimism is definitely there because that was one of Oshima's reasons for making the movie. It was kind of like his way to vent his frustration with how the movements had gone.
Yeah, those like younger more militants, right? Like they still got it. They're still working. They haven't lost it. They haven't sold out, right? So so there's definitely a value judgment there, I think.
Yeah, and there's also this whole thing about the one of the things I thought was interesting is this whole idea of how activists, growing up and kind of forgetting what they were fighting for in the first place. And I think Nakayama in part represents a lot of that, and Ozawa too, to a certain extent as well, where it's just like and you see this happen a lot. Like, you look at taking just a U.S. Example here, you've got the student protests of the 60s and the 70s, and then they're the people who end up becoming the hippies in the 1980s. Or not the hippies, the yuppies, I mean.
Oh, okay. But then it also shows that these people never really, I mean, Nozawa is a little bit different, but Nakayama's, in general, the leadership, or some of the criticism that they air in this film is that they go from like one extreme position to the other, right? But these are the same people, basically same people following they're not very critical of the position the party takes. There's not much debate happening. So they basically, like, people who are really hardcore about the armed struggle is equally hardcore about being peaceful, through dialogue, sort of hypocrisy of that, right? So, Yeah, but it does show sort of Nozawa is kind of like sort of pathetic guy. He wants to be recognized, being validated by,
Mhm.
you know, by the party, but also by Misako, and he tries really hard um, yeah, like be in the leadership or like
Mhm.
whatever. He wants to be recognized, and but not throughout the Nakayama is sort of like not very respected. Like, he's like sort of like a bougie.
Yeah, yeah.
He's sort of like he's kind of comes from a bougie background himself, but then like he has this like he doesn't really recognize that um
Right, like the typical image of like the college student who goes to the protest and then drives home in his dad's BMW to have his mom do his laundry in the mansion type of thing.
yeah, yeah, so he ends up losing it all at the end. Like, people just sort of like, oh, I don't think he's the banger, like everyone
Mhm.
sort of at the very close to the ending, like, oh, like, even Nozar's like, I don't think, I never thought this is the guy or something.
Mhm.
And his wife, the Misako, is even like, oh, I was never happy with
Mhm.
this guy kind of thing. And but he doesn't really seem to get it. He just doesn't seem to be affected.
Right, which is exemplified by his speech at the end, where he's still like,
Yeah.
it's just like he hasn't learned to think. He hasn't been listening to anything anyone has said this whole movie.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, it's such an interesting movie, and stylistically too,
Mhm.
like the camera work, and even the opening scenes, like, kind of like you feel like you're outsider,
Yeah, yeah.
like looking in, right? Or even like from the perspective of people who are showing up to this wedding uninvited,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it does that opening pan. I thought
yeah,
that really jumped out to me as well. Like, kind of like you're like walking by a hotel or something. You see the door open and a wedding going on. And just kind of like peek in and like what's going on in there type of thing.
yeah. And one of the flashbacks, they show Nakayama's wedding, Nakayama and Misako,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and they're all wearing black. Like, all
Mm-hmm.
three, the professor and Misako and Nakayama, they're wearing black. You know, in Japan, it's for weddings you're expected to like wear something lighter, right? Like a white,
Mm-hmm.
or like not black is for funeral.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I thought that was maybe like intentional to show, that basically their movement is dead, kind of thing. It was like kind of meant
That
to be like a
jump.
funeral for, yeah,
That's a
the
good point.
revolutionary
Yeah,
politics. Yeah.
because I did think it looked really weird, especially Misako, who's standing there in in a black suit, and then she's got this white veil on her head,
Yeah.
and it just and but what's interesting too is it's the exact same framing of the weddings of Nozawa and Reiko's wedding. Like, you've got the professor standing up there with them, and it's just like you got that old woman on the other side who I don't know who she is. I thought she was Reiko's mother, but then she's in the other scene too. So I'm guessing maybe she was the professor's wife or something. But it's just like this. But yeah, and you get the sense of this kind of distance between everyone, right?
Mhm.
There's no real affection there between bride and groom in either wedding, right? You get like no they looks more like they're there because they feel obligated to be there than anything else.
Mhm. Like, they have doubts about this.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing is the music, man. It's a really signature sort of auteur of um, Oshima. He does really effective use of music, in particular songs,
Mm-hmm.
and he does this in other movies as well, like "Sing a Song of Sex,"
Mm-hmm.
even "Despite Hanging," "The Boy," and the one. There's also the one called "The Ceremony." I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you've seen any of these movies.
No, I have Sing a Song of Sex. I haven't watched it yet, but it's one of those movies that I've got. A few years ago I picked up Criterion had this box set of like four Oshima movies. One of them was Sing a Song of Sex was one of them, and
Oh, Outlaw Collection, like
Oh,
Outlaw.
yeah, that was it.
I have that too. Yeah. Yeah, like he does this like a sort of contrasts different songs and sort of political meanings associated with that. And in Night and Fog in Japan, there's this one song that keeps being repeated over and over again, right? It's about telling young people to like work out, exercise, and be healthy. It's basically a song about like a self-improvement. That's why I read it. It's compared to like the other song, the protest song, and which is more like militant and anti-war, right? Like it's very like activisty song. But now after their policy changes, like now it's peaceful coexistence and dialogue. It's just like this happy song about exercising and being strong.
I thought it was, and that's interesting. It surprised me. I'm surprised that they didn't have any subtitles for those songs, because I was watching the movie and I'm like, these songs, like Oshima is not someone who just throws stuff in for no reason. These songs do have a thematic purpose here. So why wouldn't they subtitle these things so that we can kind of get clued into what's going on here a little bit more?
Yeah, I should try to find the Criterion version of it. I'm pretty sure they have subtitles for these songs, and I mean they do for other movies for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's the contrast there is really interesting, and basically also like it's just they play so many times that you get really sick of it. It's like they basically repeat the same part over and over again, right?
Yeah.
So they don't really. Yeah, so that was really interesting. And,
I think that was intentional, the repetition thing, because I think it's kind of want to drive home the fact that all you guys are doing is singing. You're not actually living up to these purposes that you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's another example of Oshima's frustration being expressed in the movie.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like for such an interesting movie.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was kind of surprised that I found it at Tsutaya of all places, which is a rental chain here in Japan, because this movie was, it was pulled from release. It eventually got a DVD release, but other than that, it's not really very. And I think Criterion, like you said, they had the streaming rights at least. I don't know if they've ever released a physical version of it though.
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's what I was reading last night, and I'm not sure if that was just an old review or not, but yeah, and Oshima's got this reputation in Japan, and even like the other movie you mentioned that you told me when we were talking back and forth about Death by Hanging. That was another one that I've never heard of before, and I couldn't find any sort of real release for, really. So
they have a physical copy. Criterion has a physical copy for that. And actually, when I watched it for the first time, I took it out of the public library.
Oh, okay.
In Canada. Yeah, like it was heavily suppressed, and he never really, after that film, I think he went independent.
He left Sochiko after that, I believe, and just because he was so frustrated with it, and
he actually got married to Koyama Akiko, who's praised Misako, I think.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
And at their wedding, so that's around when he found out about Shochiku is putting out the movie. Okay. So he basically, their wedding turned into like a spontaneous protest in March, I think. And, like a resist censorship and stuff. And, I mean, that itself is really sort of, maybe it might even be, sort of like conservative atmosphere, right? Like people, like this pre-war censorship is being revived, and actually film studios in Japan has sort of a history of workers, the strikes and militancy. Like there was a big strike in Toho in the 50s that was quite militant. It was very like combative, and they basically made all types of like gadget traps, and they even sent I think the Allied occupation sent in a military to quell it.
Oh wow.
Toho. Yeah, so it's
and it is also interesting to look at because like we were saying, there's not a lot of attention given to the protest movements and these revolutionary movements that were happening in Japan, which is even more surprising given how militant these groups were, especially in comparison to, like I don't think with some exceptions, there wasn't as much militancy in like in the American movements and stuff like that, and just like, but there's been this complete, almost like semi-erasure of a lot of what happened back then, and like the conservative government and their alliances with the Yakuza and all that, they so suppressed these groups that it basically crippled activism in Japan after that.
Yeah, even on the ample protests in 1960, I think they sent in a bunch of like hired Yakuzas to suppress the protest. Yeah, and this event, it was sort of transitioned into, in 8 years after that, there's another like upsurge of protest, militant protests in occupations, like school occupations, university campuses, in 1968, like part of the long 60s, or like global 68 or whatever. And but by the time the JCB was like completely like, old people's party, and they weren't very relevant, more like new left revolutionary groups are popping up. So the film kind of prefigures that turn as well. And the episode coming up that the interview I did was Chelsea Sandy Shatter. She wrote a book called Co-ed Revolution, A Woman in the Japanese New Left.
Oh, okay.
So we talk about the revolutionary woman. The book actually talks about Kamba Michiko, who is the woman who was killed in the 1960 ample protest. The film mentions her, like the female student was killed.
Sorry, what was the name of the book?
Co-ed Revolution by Chelsea Sandy Shatter.
Yeah.
So Kamba Michiko is the female students who died at the protest that the film mentions. Yeah, so like how the media represented or misrepresented these women as a sort of like a vulnerable, or either sort of like vulnerable or like ridiculous, like sexually promiscuous, like femme fatale kind of figure, or a sort of dangerous terrorist. They kind of silenced the voices of these women themselves. And the book also talks about like sexism and misogyny in the student movement. There's some of that in the film as well. Like some of the things that being said.
Oh yeah, well there's
in the movie are kind of like a sexist, and even like the characters, the female characters are referred by their first names, like Misako and Reiko, but all the male characters are referred by their with their family names.
Yeah.
And the one guy Tora, like he says, "Oh, like you woman, we're all the same," kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah. That
selfish,
jumped out to me as
like,
well.
It was probably like reflects the political culture of the time, and I don't know how critical Oshima was of that. Actually,
well, you also have kind of like
sorry.
There's also that kind of like objectification of the two women in it. Like Misako is almost like a prize in some ways.
Oh yeah, totally. Like,
and it seems like Reiko is like a consolation prize to Nozawa because he lost Misako.
Yeah, they're basically, as a woman, are sort of like referred to as like entertainment kind of thing.
Yeah.
Come hang out with girls kind of thing. And also like the sort of like a rape. Nozawa is kind of
he's very aggressive. Yeah.
And actually, Chelsea and I talk about sort of like the use of sexual violence as an allegory in this new wave of films like Oshima and Wakamatsu films, and we kind of go into that a bit. If you're
that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, check out this new episode. But yeah, it is a sort of a complex legacy. These are sort of lack of feminist analysis in his films, but at the same time, like very strong anti-colonial. He's very much interested in Korea and the struggle of Zainichi Koreans, and that's present in throughout his work. So, um, yeah, critical engagement is necessary for sure.
Yeah, yeah. That's it is interesting when because I teach a lot of these films to my students, and one of the things that always surprises me when I'm teaching them is I try to put them in the historical context, and a lot of them don't know about this type of historical context. And like I haven't taught this film, but I've taught like the original Godzilla, and I've tried to put and I've taught some other, and Battle Royale is one that I teach too, which is such a political film once you know a little bit about Japanese history and politics. But it just gets, you know, there's just so much stuff that people just aren't really aware of.
And I think Oshima's films are really consistent with my podcast. I think about it a lot, and in one of the interviews, he said he basically banishes color green from his films because that represents a sort of like traditional Japanese cinema.
Ah, okay.
And also like sort of sense of sort of like a traditional Japaneseness, like tatami. The color is green, and so his films are very much against Japanism. You know,
yeah.
Even the film Boy, it's really strong in there too. Yeah, have you seen it?
No. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, like even though I've got the collection, I think this may have actually been the first Oshima film I've seen.
Oh, really?
May have been. I'm not sure.
You're missing out. You should.
I know. I've got the collection. As just like I have so many movies that I just haven't watched yet.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
It's just one of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I live in Toronto, and Toronto International Film Festival has their own theater, and sometimes they just do a series of these old orchards, and they had like a series dedicated to Oshima, so I get to see some of these movies in theater before the pandemic.
That was one of the things I missed about being in Chicago, was just we had a similar type of theater, and that was actually how I it wasn't the first, I didn't watch that, but it was how I kind of discovered Takashi Miike. I became like a bigger fan of his, was because they were showing movies at this like little, you know, art house theater there. And it was funny when I first moved here, I thought like, oh, I'll get to see all these Japanese films, and it's like I get here and it's like it's almost like it's harder to find them actually in some ways.
Yeah, even though I missed like all these mini theaters, like me and my mom always used to go to these like small theaters in Shibuya, or really everywhere, like in most random places, and showing films that no one's not playing anywhere else.
Yeah.
But I mean, we do have some independent theaters here, but it doesn't feel the same way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts about Night and Fog in Japan that you like to mention?
I mean, probably for those of you listening, if you haven't seen it, you probably have no idea what we're talking about. But try to get your hands on it and watch. It's a really great movie, and I discover something new every time. And I actually watched it twice for this interview.
Oh, okay.
Once with English subtitle and the other without it. But actually, like the second time, I pay more attention. Because when you're looking at subtitles, I always want even though I understand Japanese, I like to watch it with like subtitles on to like see like consistency and how they translate and stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you kind of like you pay more attention to the subtitles and don't actually pay attention to what's going on in the screen. So
yeah, I watch because my wife is Japanese, so sometimes if we have Japanese subtitles, we'll watch them with Japanese subtitles on, or if not, then we'll use English subtitles. And I find myself doing the same thing. Like even with the Japanese subtitles, I find myself trying to read the Japanese as best I can.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm probably gonna use this opportunity to watch other Oshima films again. But But yeah, thanks for having me. And
Well, thank you.
it's
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff, and I'm definitely learning a lot, just not from this conversation only, but also from your show in general. So, tell people where they can find your show.
You can um you can find me on Twitter at Against Japanism, on Instagram also Against Japanism. One of them is Against Japanism podcast. I think my Twitter handle is Against Japanism podcast, and Instagram is just Against Japanism, but there's no other podcast named that, so it's
It looks like it's the other way
easy.
around. I just
is it?
double check. Yeah. It's Against Japanism is the Twitter one, and so I guess the podcast one would be the at least the username is Against Japanism on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean it should pretty easy to find it.
Yeah. If you just type in Against Japanism, it should pop right up.
And there's a link to my link tree that has a link to my podcast, so you can probably also Google it too, and it shows up. Yeah, stay tuned for the future episodes, and the one coming up is with Chelsea Sandy Shetter, who is a professor at Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she specializes on feminism and women's movements in Japan. We're going to talk about her recent book, Co-ed Revolution, Women in the Japanese New Left. After that, I have another interview coming up with Shigenobu Mei. She is a journalist. She's a Japanese Palestinian journalist based in Lebanon. She's also the daughter of Shigenobu Sako, who was a member of Japanese Red Army.
Oh, okay.
And currently a political prisoner and held in prison in Tokyo. She's actually scheduled to be released May 2022.
Okay.
So May and I we're talking about Palestine and the history of Japan-Israel relationship, but also the history of solidarity between Japanese people and Palestine. We still have to record the second part of the interview, but first part is already recorded, and we had a great time talking about Palestine and
the connection between the Palestinians and the Japan Red Army. That was something I'd only recently learned about for the first time, and so I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for that, because that's something I definitely want to learn more about. Yeah,
for those of you interested, you should check out Red Army PFLP Declaration of World War by Adachi Masao and Wakamatsu Koji, who are affiliates, they're colleagues of Oshima. Adachi actually was even in the film, actually, in the Night and Fog in Japan.
Oh, really?
I think he's one of the younger activists.
Oh, okay.
Actually, who runs out at the end? He basically, let's let people know that Ota was arrested, and basically he ditches the wedding and goes join the protest. He's a filmmaker himself. He actually wrote the script for Death by Hanging under pseudonym.
Oh, okay.
So he worked closely with Oshima.
I thought that name sounded familiar. Yeah.
So he ended up going to Lebanon and he ended up joining the Japanese Red Army until he was captured in like early 2000s, and he was extradited back to Japan. And he had his passport canceled. So he's stuck in Japan, but he's still making movies. Why was I talking about this? Oh yeah, so there's a movie about sort of political documentary / sort of a political propaganda about Japanese Red Army and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It's on YouTube, so if you search it, it'll come up. And
okay, great.
Yeah, it's a great documentary. So my episode with Mei Shigenobu touches on that. So check it
Great.
out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. The podcast has been great. It's very, very informative, and it's teaching me a lot about this kind of this history that you don't learn much about in Japan and these types of movements. So thank you for that. It's something I'm also going to be using in my classes when it's relevant too.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. You should show the film to your students.
I was actually planning to, but they had we had watched a few different older movies this semester, so I showed them Yojimbo and I showed them Lady Snowblood, and they had a very they didn't like they had a very adverse reaction to
Oh, really?
to the more old-fashioned style of cinema. So I
Do
just
you think it's too slow or
a little bit too slow. Same thing. Godzilla is also one I showed them too. So I had originally scheduled to show them this one, but I got cold feet at the last minute, and I thought, well, I want to learn more about it too before I show them this. And I figured it was this was going to be the last movie this semester, but I decided to. We went with the documentary Hafu instead to talk more about the rising multiculturalism in Japan.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you teach in Japanese or in English?
No, I teach in English. I teach in it's like it's called a Gaigo Gakuin. It's a post-secondary, just like a 1-year program. Students come to basically get like intensive English language learning, but we
like
don't.
A Tandai.
Yeah. Except it's really like it's one of the only schools like this in Japan, but we teach regular subjects, but we teach them all in English, but they're related to Japanese culture in some way, or so I teach 3 classes there. I teach one in Japanese film, I teach one in Japanese literature, and I also teach one on current global issues. So talk about different types of things, like the death penalty was one thing we talked about recently, COVID-19 obviously, and poverty and all sorts of stuff like that.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, Kota, thanks again for coming on. We'll have to have you come back again when we get a chance to watch Death by Hanging or something else in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much for having me, and maybe I'll come visit Kagoshima. I always wanted to go there.
Hey,
I always want to go to Yakushima too. Like I really.
Yeah.
Do you go there every weekend or something?
Oh no! I've actually never been to Yakushima.
Oh really?
I've been to. It's one of those things when you're in a place, like when you're living in a place, you don't feel the pressure to go visit all these different places. So like I've been here for like 13 years and I haven't been to Yakushima yet. I've been to Amami Oshima one time, but that's the only island I've really gone to so far.
Cool.
But yeah, we would like to go. Now that I've got a family now. Once my daughter gets a little bit older, then we might be more interested in doing some, going to some islands and stuff like that. Especially because my wife's family is from Amami to begin with. So
cool.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do this again sometime.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, same here. And yeah, if you ever do make it out to Kagoshima, then definitely drop me a line and we'll get together and talk more in person then. Okay. All right.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. All right. So this does it for this episode in this season of Japan on Film. Come back next season in a few months and we'll have some new episodes with some new guests for you. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Hey guys, just wanted to say thank you for listening to this season of Japan on Film. Sorry for the delay in getting a lot of these episodes out. As many of you remember from a few months back, when my co-host Derek Ferguson passed away on my other show, that kind of threw a whole lot of things out of whack for me. And so I had dropped the ball on a few of the releases and following up on people who were supposed to come on the show this season. So apologies for all that. If you're someone I was speaking to about coming on this season and, if I never got back to you, if I never followed up again, my apologies for that. Please get back to me as soon as possible, and we'll see what we can do about that. Also, I want to let you know that this is the last episode of the season, so we will be taking a break as usual. And as we're getting ready for Season 8, I want to put out a call out there for anyone who is a fan of the show, anyone who has been on the show before, wants to come on again, or if you haven't been on the show before but are interested in coming on, please get in touch with me. you can go to japanonfilm.com. On the website there, I've got a list of movies that I have in my possession, but I haven't yet spotlighted on the show. So you can use that as kind of like a guide for movies that I'd be interested in discussing on the show. It's by no means limited to that. If you're interested in a movie that is not on that list, and I obviously haven't covered it before in a previous episode, then send me an email and let me know what you'd be interested in, and I'll see if it's something that I can track down, that I can find, and we can try and sort that out. So again, that is japanonfilm.com. You can go find the link to the list of movies on there. It's called Movies to Cover, and you can also find a link to a contact form. Use that contact form to get in touch with me if you'd be interested in being on the show. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next season. Thanks for watching this episode of Japan on Film. For more of our videos, just hit the subscribe button.